The psychological warfare Ethan waged during his detention was subtle but relentless. Other juveniles in the facility reported feeling unsettled around him, though they couldn't articulate why. He never threatened anyone directly. He never broke rules. But there was something in the way he watched people, the way he seemed to be constantly analyzing, calculating, measuring everyone around him for weaknesses. The facility's psychologist, Dr. Raymond Torres, conducted weekly sessions with Ethan as part of his mandatory evaluation. These sessions became a bizarre intellectual dance, with Ethan treating them as opportunities to study human behavior rather than reflect on his own. Dr. Torres's notes documented a disturbing pattern. The boy showed no progress, no growth, no movement toward understanding why his actions were wrong. Instead, he grew more sophisticated in mimicking appropriate responses. "He's learning to be a better actor," Dr. Torres wrote in one evaluation. "He studies my reactions to his statements and adjusts accordingly. He's not developing empathy. He's developing camouflage." The discovery of additional evidence months after the trial sent new shockwaves through the investigation. A construction crew demolishing the abandoned site where Marcus had been killed found a hidden compartment beneath loose floorboards. Inside was a waterproof container holding more of Ethan's documentation, earlier notebooks that predated the ones found in his room, going back nearly 3 years. The entries were chilling in their progression, showing the evolution of his fantasies from vague, violent thoughts to detailed murder plans. What made these notebooks particularly disturbing was the evidence of prior attempts. Ethan had documented at least 4 occasions where he'd tried to lure potential victims to secluded locations. 3 had been unsuccessful. The intended victims hadn't taken the bait, had been too cautious, or circumstances had prevented him from following through. He'd written analysis of each failure, treating them as learning experiences, identifying what went wrong and how to improve his approach. Marcus Sullivan hadn't been chosen randomly. He'd been selected specifically because of his compassionate nature. Ethan had observed him at the community center, had watched how he interacted with the kids he tutored, had recognized that Marcus's instinct to help others made him vulnerable. It was predatory behavior with a sophistication that should have taken decades to develop, not 11 years. The notebooks also revealed something that made investigators' blood run cold: a ranking system. Ethan had created a list of potential future victims, ranked by what he called viability scores, based on their routines, accessibility, and likelihood of being missed quickly. Marcus had been at the top of his list, but there were 17 other names below his. Real people from the San Diego area, most of whom had no idea they'd been stalked by a child. Detective Williams personally contacted each person on the list to inform them of the situation. The conversations were surreal, explaining to unsuspecting citizens that they'd been targeted by an 11-year-old serial killer in training, that they'd been watched and studied, that their daily routines had been documented in meticulous detail. Several required police protection temporarily, not from Ethan himself, who was securely locked away, but from the psychological trauma of knowing how close they'd come to becoming victims. The media coverage of the case became a national obsession. News networks ran endless segments debating the nature versus nurture question. Was Ethan born this way, or had something in his environment created him? The Crawford family's insistence that they'd provided a normal, loving home seemed credible to some, evidence of innate evil to others. Mrs. Crawford gave a tearful interview on a national television, describing her son as a sweet boy who'd somehow been corrupted by violent media, by exposure to darkness online, by anything except the possibility that he'd simply been born without a conscience. Her desperate need to find an external cause was understandable, but ultimately fruitless. Every avenue of investigation, led back to the same conclusion. Ethan Crawford had shown signs of psychopathy from his earliest years. His preschool teachers, interviewed as part of a documentary on the case, recalled disturbing behaviors they dismissed at the time. He'd been the child who pulled wings off butterflies and then studied the insect's movements with scientific interest. He'd been caught multiple times hurting other children during playtime, pinching, biting, pushing, but always in ways that could be explained as accidents. Even at 4 years old, he'd understood plausible deniability. His elementary school records revealed a pattern of manipulation that had escalated over time. Teachers noted that he was unusually persuasive and had a gift for avoiding consequences. One second-grade teacher had written in her notes, "Ethan seems to know exactly what adults want to hear. I'm concerned that his emotional responses don't match his words. He cries on command, but his eyes remain flat." The systemic failures that had allowed Ethan to progress unchecked became a subject of intense scrutiny. How many warning signs had been rationalized away? How many concerning behaviors had been dismissed as boys being boys, or just a phase? The case exposed the uncomfortable truth that society is often unwilling to label children as dangerous, preferring to maintain the fiction of childhood innocence even in the face of mounting evidence. Emma Crawford's testimony, initially given in closed session, was eventually released to the public. After her parents waived confidentiality in a misguided attempt to garner sympathy. The transcript was devastating. She described years of psychological abuse, of being forced to witness her brother's experiments on animals, of being told she'd be next if she ever revealed his secrets. "He would show me pictures," she told the court, her voice barely audible. "Pictures of what he did to the neighbor's cat. And he'd say that cats and people aren't really that different inside. He'd ask me if I wanted to see if that was true." Emma revealed that Ethan had practiced on her, not physically, but psychologically. He'd study her reactions to fear, timing how long she'd cry, observing how she'd try to appease him, to make the threats stop. She'd been his laboratory for understanding human terror, a training ground for the manipulation he'd eventually use on Marcus Sullivan. The failure of adults to protect Emma became a rallying cry for reform. Child psychologists appeared before legislative committees, advocating for better training in identifying childhood psychopathy. The signs were there, they argued, if people were willing to see them. The triad of bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals that Ethan had exhibited. The superficial charm masking emotional emptiness. The inability to form genuine emotional connections. The Crawford family ultimately divorced, their marriage unable to survive the revelation of what their son had become. Mr. Crawford moved across the country, changing his name, trying to build a life separate from the infamy. Mrs. Crawford remained in San Diego, though she sold their home and moved to a small apartment. She continued to visit Ethan in detention, the only family member who maintained contact, still clinging to the belief that somewhere inside the monster was the boy she'd raised. Those visits, monitored and recorded, showed the true nature of their relationship. Ethan was performative with his mother, telling her what she wanted to hear, maintaining the fiction that he was remorseful and changed. But facility staff noted that within minutes of her departure, his demeanor would shift back to cold detachment. The visits weren't about connection. They were about maintaining his one remaining source of outside contact and material comfort. The legal precedent set by Ethan's case reverberated through the juvenile justice system nationwide. Courts across the country began grappling with how to handle child offenders who exhibited clear psychopathic traits. The traditional rehabilitative model seemed inadequate for individuals who showed no capacity for rehabilitation. Yet treating children as irredeemable monsters raised profound ethical questions about the nature of justice and mercy. District Attorney Michael Chen became a sought-after speaker on the topic, invited to law schools and conferences to discuss the prosecution of juvenile psychopaths. His presentations focused on the need for a third category in the justice system, neither traditional juvenile rehabilitation nor adult prosecution, but something specifically designed for young offenders who posed ongoing threats to public safety. "We need to be honest about what we're seeing," he'd tell audiences. "There are children born without the neurological capacity for empathy. It's not their fault, but it's also not something we can wish away or rehabilitate through good intentions. Society has an obligation to protect itself, and that means confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature." The academic community was divided. Some researchers agreed with Chen's assessment, pointing to neurological studies showing structural differences in the brains of psychopaths, reduced activity in areas responsible for emotional processing, heightened activity in regions associated with reward seeking. Others argued that the brain's plasticity during childhood meant even psychopathic traits could potentially be modified with intensive intervention. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who'd conducted Ethan's initial evaluation, published a controversial paper arguing that children like Ethan should be identified as early as possible and subjected to intensive monitoring and treatment programs. "We can't cure psychopathy," she wrote, "but we might be able to teach behavioral controls that prevent violent acting out. The key is early identification, before the first human victim." Her proposal was met with fierce backlash from civil liberties advocates who argued it would create a system of pre-crime punishment, where children could be labeled and restricted based on predictions rather than actions. The debate highlighted the impossible tension between public safety and individual rights, between protecting potential victims and preserving the presumption of innocence. Meanwhile, in his secure facility, Ethan adapted to his circumstances with the same methodical approach he'd applied to everything else. He studied the routines of guards, the procedures of the facility, the vulnerabilities in the system. He wasn't planning an escape. Even he understood that was unlikely. But he couldn't stop himself from analyzing, cataloging, looking for leverage. He became friendly with the educational staff, impressing them with his intellectual curiosity and academic performance. He requested advanced mathematics and science materials, devouring textbooks on biology, chemistry, and anatomy with an intensity that would have been admirable in different circumstances. But the content of his essay assignments revealed disturbing preoccupations, detailed analyses of death, decomposition, the physiology of pain. One essay, written for an English class assignment on a transformative experience, was so troubling that it was immediately forwarded to the facility's administration and eventually to law enforcement. In it, Ethan described the murder of Marcus Sullivan with literary flourish, framing it as his awakening to his true nature. He wrote about it with a reverent tone of religious conversion, describing the moment of taking a life as achieving a state of clarity he'd never experienced before. In that moment, he'd written, "I understood my purpose. Everything before had been preparation. Everything after is waiting." The essay was entered into his permanent record as evidence of ongoing dangerousness. It would be cited in every future evaluation, every parole hearing, every assessment of his threat level. His own words had created an indelible record of his continuing predatory mindset. The question of media access to juvenile offenders became another contentious issue sparked by Ethan's case. Several true crime producers and documentary filmmakers requested interviews with him, offering substantial fees that would go into a victim's compensation fund. Some argued that understanding the mind of a child psychopath could provide valuable insights. Others insisted that giving him a platform would only feed his narcissism, and further traumatize Marcus Sullivan's family. The court ultimately denied all media requests, determining that Ethan would benefit psychologically from the attention in ways that posed security risks. Judge Morrison's ruling cited his demonstrated tendency toward exhibitionism and performance, his need for an audience to validate his sense of superiority. This defendant, she wrote in her order, views his crimes as accomplishments worthy of recognition. Providing him access to media platforms would constitute a reward for his behavior and would likely encourage grandiose delusions about his own importance. His victims and their families deserve to heal without the continued public spectacle of his narcissism. The ruling was upheld on appeal, establishing precedent for limiting media access to juvenile offenders in cases where such access might reinforce antisocial behaviors. Grace Sullivan threw herself into advocacy work with a ferocity born of grief. The Marcus Sullivan Foundation grew from a modest memorial fund into a nationally recognized organization. She lobbied for legislation requiring schools to report patterns of animal cruelty to law enforcement. She funded research into early intervention programs for children showing psychopathic traits. She spoke at conferences and on college campuses, telling her son's story with a raw honesty that moved audiences to tears. "My son died because people didn't want to believe a child could be dangerous," she'd tell crowds. We're so invested in the idea of childhood innocence that we ignore evidence of childhood evil. If one teacher, one counselor, one neighbor had taken the warning signs seriously, Marcus might still be alive. Her advocacy led to Marcus's Law in California, requiring mandatory reporting of certain behaviors by school personnel and medical professionals. Specifically, the combination of animal cruelty, fire setting, and violent ideation in children. The law was controversial, with critics arguing it would lead to over-reporting and stigmatization of troubled but non-dangerous children. Supporters countered that some false positives were acceptable if the law prevented even one future victim. The law's first year of implementation resulted in over 300 reports. Most led to family counseling and mental health interventions. 4 led to more serious interventions, including one case where investigators discovered a 13-year-old with a detailed plan to poison his family. The boy was placed in a residential treatment facility, and his parents credited Marcus's Law with saving their lives. Emma Crawford, now under a new identity through witness protection protocols, struggled with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress. She'd been the one person who'd truly known what her brother was, and she'd been too terrified to speak up. In therapy sessions, she repeatedly asked if she could have prevented Marcus's death if she'd just been braver, if she'd told someone despite Ethan's threats. Her therapist's assurances that she'd been a child, that the responsibility lay with adults who should have protected her, provided little comfort. She carried the weight of knowledge. She'd known her brother was a monster, and a good man had died anyway. It would take years of intensive therapy before she could begin to forgive herself for failing to be the hero a 9-year-old child couldn't possibly have been. Detective Williams, in her retirement, often thought about the case that had ended her career. She joined law enforcement with idealistic notions about justice, about making a difference, about the fundamental goodness of humanity. Ethan Crawford had forced her to confront the existence of evil as an intrinsic quality, not something created by circumstances or environment, but something that could simply exist from birth. In interviews for the true crime books that inevitably followed the case, she was honest about its impact on her worldview. "I used to believe everyone could be redeemed," she'd say. "Now I believe that some people are born broken in ways we can't fix. That's a hard truth to accept, especially when you're looking into the eyes of a child. But the alternative, pretending that truth doesn't exist, costs innocent lives." The San Diego community slowly healed, though the scars remained visible. The community center where Marcus had tutored was renamed in his honor. His photograph hung in the lobby, surrounded by thank you notes from the children he'd helped. The parking lot where he'd been abducted was completely redesigned, the entire area now well lit and covered by security cameras, a physical manifestation of the lessons learned in blood. Parents became more vigilant, perhaps too vigilant. Any child displaying aggressive behavior came under intense scrutiny. School counselors reported a dramatic increase in referrals, most of them false alarms driven by community trauma rather than genuine danger. The pendulum had swung from willful blindness to hypervigilance, neither extreme representing a healthy equilibrium. The psychological impact on the jury was profound and lasting. Several jurors required therapy to process what they'd witnessed during the trial. The obligation to sit in judgment of a child, to declare an 11-year-old beyond redemption, had shaken them in ways they struggled to articulate. One juror later described the experience as having to kill something in myself, the part that wanted to believe all children could be saved. The foreperson of the jury, a retired teacher named Margaret Chen, became an advocate for jury support services. She spoke publicly about the lasting trauma of her jury service, the nightmares that followed, the way certain triggers, seeing a boy around Ethan's age, hearing about child crimes in the news, would send her back to that courtroom. "We did our duty," she'd say in interviews. "I don't regret the verdict, but people need to understand that jury service in cases like this comes with a cost. We carry what we witnessed for the rest of our lives." As years passed, Ethan Crawford became older in body, but showed no signs of growth in emotional capacity. Staff at the facility noted that he'd mastered the language of rehabilitation. He could discuss his issues using therapeutic terminology, could articulate insights about his behavior, could perform remorse with the skill of a trained actor. But his eyes remained empty, his emotional displays always slightly off, like an alien who'd learned to mimic human expression without understanding the underlying feelings. Dr. Torres continued his regular evaluations, documenting Ethan's development with clinical precision. His reports painted a picture of a highly intelligent psychopath learning to navigate a system designed to rehabilitate people with consciences. Ethan understood that expressing the right sentiments at the right times would be crucial to any future parole consideration. He was playing a long game, preparing for the day, 30 years in the future, when he'd face a parole board. The discovery of his writings continued to provide disturbing insights into his thinking. Journal entries showed that he viewed his incarceration as an extended period of study and preparation. He wrote about how confinement was teaching him patience, how interaction with other offenders was educating him about human psychology, how even failure could be instructive if properly analyzed. The mistake, he'd written in one entry found during a routine cell inspection, was not the act itself but the evidence management. Emotion made me careless, the desire to keep the trophy. Next time, discipline will override sentiment. Next time, perfection. The next time sent chills through everyone who read it. After everything, the arrest, the trial, the conviction, the sentence, Ethan was still planning, still anticipating a future where he'd be free to continue what he'd started. His incarceration wasn't punishment to him, it was an intermission. The parole hearing, scheduled for 30 years in the future, had already become a subject of debate among legal scholars and victim advocacy groups. What criteria should be used to determine if a psychopath is safe to release? Could someone who'd never shown genuine remorse ever be deemed rehabilitated? How do you assess genuine change versus sophisticated manipulation in someone who'd spent 3 decades perfecting their performance? Grace Sullivan had already publicly vowed to appear at every parole hearing for the rest of her life if necessary. She'd be in her 70s by the time Ethan was first eligible for parole, but she was determined to be there, to ensure that Marcus's voice would be heard, that the board would remember the young man whose life had been stolen. The broader implications of Ethan's case continued to ripple through society. The intersection of childhood, psychopathy, and justice raised questions that had no easy answers. How young is too young to be held fully accountable? At what age does the potential for change give way to the reality of unchangeable nature? Where is the line between a troubled child who needs help and a dangerous predator who needs to be contained? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They had real consequences for policy, for how society invested resources, for how the justice system treated young offenders. Ethan Crawford had become a test case, a lens through which to examine humanity's most difficult truths about itself. In the facility's education program, Ethan excelled in debate club, demonstrating a frightening skill at arguing any position, regardless of his actual beliefs. He could argue for compassion and redemption with the same intellectual rigor he'd once used to plan a murder. It was all performance to him, all intellectual exercise divorced from genuine conviction. His debate coach, initially impressed by his ability, gradually became unsettled by the realization that Ethan didn't believe any of the positions he defended. He was simply skilled at identifying what arguments would be most persuasive, what emotional appeals would resonate, what logical frameworks would be most convincing. The content was irrelevant. Only the effect mattered. This ability to mimic human reasoning without underlying human feeling was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Ethan's psychology. He could sound more compassionate than truly compassionate people, could articulate moral principles more eloquently than those who actually lived by them. He was a perfect counterfeit, and only prolonged observation revealed the emptiness beneath the surface. The anniversary of Marcus Sullivan's death became an annual day of remembrance in San Diego. The community center held events honoring his memory, celebrating his life rather than focusing on his death. Children he'd tutored, now older, shared stories about his patience and kindness. The Marcus Sullivan Memorial Scholarship sent deserving students to college, ensuring that his legacy of helping others continued beyond his death. But these commemorations were bittersweet, shadowed by the knowledge that the person who'd stolen Marcus's future was still alive, still studying, still waiting. The contrast between Marcus's life of service and Ethan's life of predation could not have been starker. One had seen other people as worthy of love and support. The other had seen them as objects for experimentation and control. The case files on Ethan Crawford filled multiple storage boxes at the San Diego Police Department, a growing archive of a life spent in captivity. Every evaluation, every incident report, every piece of correspondence added to the record. Future psychologists and criminologists would study these files, trying to understand the development of a psychopath from childhood through adulthood, trying to identify patterns that might help predict and prevent future cases. But for those who'd lived through the immediate horror, the Sullivan family, the investigators, the prosecutors, the jury, Ethan Crawford wasn't a case study. He was a nightmare made real, a reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear most are the ones we're least prepared to recognize. As the sun set over San Diego Bay, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the city continued its rhythms of daily life. Families walked along the beach. Children played in parks. The vibrant energy of California coastal living persisted. But beneath that sun-soaked surface, there remained an awareness, a shadow of knowledge that couldn't be erased. Evil exists. Sometimes it's born, not made, and sometimes it wears the face of a child. The institutional mechanisms designed to manage juvenile offenders were strained by Ethan's presence. His age required placement in a juvenile facility, but his psychological profile suggested he belonged in maximum security with adult psychopaths. The compromise, a specialized wing within the juvenile system, created a unique challenge for staff who had to balance the legal requirements of treating him as a child with the practical necessity of treating him as a high-security threat. Staff turnover in Ethan's unit was notably high. Working with him required constant vigilance, an exhausting awareness that every interaction was being analyzed and cataloged by a predator looking for weaknesses. He never made explicit threats. He never violated rules in obvious ways. But his presence created an atmosphere of unease that proved psychologically taxing for even experienced corrections officers. One incident, seemingly minor but revealing, occurred during a routine educational session. A new teacher, unaware of Ethan's history, had assigned a creative writing project about a person who changed your life. While other juveniles wrote about family members, mentors, or friends, Ethan submitted a piece about Marcus Sullivan. The essay was technically brilliant, grammatically perfect, narratively compelling, emotionally evocative. He described Marcus as his teacher, someone who'd helped him understand himself. The language seemed appropriate until you understood what he was actually saying. Marcus hadn't been a victim, but a lesson, an educational experience that had taught Ethan about his own capabilities. The teacher, upon learning the context, submitted the essay to administration and requested transfer to another unit. She couldn't continue working with someone who could write so beautifully about the man he'd murdered, who could frame the act as something approximating gratitude. The essay was added to his file, more evidence of his fundamental inability to process human relationships in normal ways. The psychological literature on juvenile psychopathy grew substantially in the years following Ethan's conviction, with his case frequently cited as a particularly clear example of early-onset antisocial personality disorder. Researchers debated whether early identification and intervention could alter the trajectory of children like him, or whether the neurological deficits that created psychopathy were too fundamental to modify. Some promising research emerged from longitudinal studies of at-risk children who received intensive early intervention. In some cases, children who displayed early warning signs of psychopathy, callousness, manipulation, cruelty, showed improved behavioral control after years of targeted therapy. Or they didn't develop empathy, but they learned to inhibit violent impulses through understanding consequences and developing behavioral controls. But these success stories came with caveats. The interventions required enormous resources, intensive therapy, family involvement, consistent follow-through over many years. And even successful cases didn't represent cures. They represented management. The underlying psychological deficits remained. These individuals had simply learned to control behaviors that came naturally to them, the way someone with addiction learns to manage cravings without eliminating them. Dr. Hernandez published a follow-up study 5 years after Ethan's conviction, examining 40 cases of children who'd exhibited similar warning signs. Her findings were sobering. Of the 40 children studied, 32 had received some form of intervention. Of those 32, 21 showed improved behavioral control. But among the 11 who continued to escalate despite intervention were several who'd gone on to commit serious violence. The uncomfortable truth, Dr. Hernandez wrote in her conclusion, is that we cannot currently predict with certainty which children displaying psychopathic traits will become violent adults. We can identify risk factors, but risk is not destiny. The ethical dilemma is profound. How do we balance protecting potential future victims with respecting the rights of children who may never actually commit violence. This dilemma played out in school districts across the country as administrators grappled with students who displayed concerning behaviors. Zero-tolerance policies led to kindergarteners being suspended for pointing finger guns. But leniency sometimes meant missing genuine threats until after tragedy struck. Finding the balance required wisdom that seemed in perpetually short supply. The Crawford family's dissolution was complete by the 5th anniversary of Ethan's conviction. Emma had been adopted by relatives who changed her name and moved to another state. She was thriving in therapy, slowly building a life separate from her brother's shadow. She'd asked that all contact with her biological parents be severed, unable to forgive their years of willful blindness. Mrs. Crawford's visits to Ethan became less frequent over time, the emotional toll of maintaining her delusion becoming unsustainable. In their monitored conversations, he'd tell her what she wanted to hear, that he was sorry, that he was changing, that he was becoming the son she'd always believed him to be. But the facility staff could see what she couldn't or wouldn't. He was managing her, maintaining her as a resource for future use. Mr. Crawford never visited, never wrote. He'd publicly stated that the boy in that facility wasn't his son, that whatever Ethan had been or pretended to be was gone, replaced by something Mr. Crawford couldn't bring himself to acknowledge as his child. For this rejection, while psychologically protective for the father, eliminated any possibility of family accountability for the warning signs they'd ignored. The financial impact on the Crawford family was substantial. Legal fees for Ethan's defense had consumed most of their savings. Civil suits from the Sullivan family had resulted in judgments that would take decades to pay off. The family home had been sold to satisfy some of these debts. The comfortable upper-middle-class life they'd enjoyed was gone, replaced by financial struggle that felt like delayed justice to some, insufficient to others. Grace Sullivan had mixed feelings about the civil suits. The money wouldn't bring Marcus back, wouldn't fill the hole in her heart. But holding Ethan's parents financially accountable felt necessary. They'd ignored warning signs, had failed to protect their own daughter from their son's abuse, had created the environment where a monster could develop unchecked. The financial judgment was a statement that parental denial has consequences beyond the immediate family. The community center where Marcus had volunteered underwent a complete transformation in the years following his death. Security was enhanced. Background checks became more rigorous. Staff received training in threat assessment and recognizing concerning behaviors in youth. The changes were necessary but sad, evidence that the world was less safe than people wanted to believe, that vigilance was required even in spaces dedicated to helping children. One of the kids Marcus had tutored, a girl named Sophia, who'd been struggling with math, became an advocate for child safety after his death. She'd grown up, watching her parents become hypervigilant, watching her community transform from trusting to suspicious. In college, she studied criminal psychology, driven by a need to understand what had happened to her mentor. In an interview years later, Sophia reflected on the lasting impact. Marcus taught me that kindness matters, that helping others matters, but his death taught me that we have to be smart about our kindness, that being good doesn't protect you from people who are bad. Both lessons shaped who I became. This duality, maintaining compassion while acknowledging danger, became the central challenge for communities processing cases like Ethan's. How do you teach children to be kind without making them vulnerable? How do you promote trust while teaching appropriate wariness? The balance seemed impossible to strike. The media gradually moved on to other stories, other tragedies, but the digital record remained permanent. Online forums dedicated to true crime continued to discuss Ethan's case, analyzing every detail, theorizing about causes, and missed opportunities. Some of these discussions were thoughtful, grappling with genuine questions about psychology and justice. Others were exploitative, treating real tragedy as entertainment. The Sullivan family had to regularly battle to have photographs of Marcus removed from unauthorized true crime videos and podcasts. Their son's image was being used without permission to generate ad revenue for content creators who'd never known him, who treated his death as just another story to monetize. The continued violation felt like ongoing assault. Fresh wounds opened repeatedly by strangers seeking profit from their grief. Grace eventually hired a digital rights management firm to aggressively pursue copyright claims and take down notices. It was exhausting, expensive, and never fully successful. The internet's hunger for true crime content was insatiable, and Marcus's story, with its elements of childhood evil and suburban horror, was catnip for algorithm-driven content creation. Ethan himself became aware of his online notoriety through letters he received from the outside. Some were from legitimate researchers requesting interviews. Others were from disturbed individuals who admired what he'd done, who saw him as some kind of icon. These letters were screened by facility staff, but Ethan knew they existed. The knowledge that he'd achieved a twisted form of fame fed his narcissism in ways that concerned his evaluators. Dr. Torres noted in one report, "Subject shows awareness of public interest in his case and displays satisfaction at having achieved notoriety. He views media coverage as validation of his significance. This narcissistic gratification presents ongoing concerns for risk assessment, as future attention-seeking behaviors cannot be ruled out." The concern was that Ethan might commit future violence specifically to generate more attention, to reclaim the spotlight he'd briefly enjoyed during his trial. The attention of the world, even negative attention, was a reward for someone with his psychological profile. Infamy was still fame. The 10th anniversary of Marcus Sullivan's death brought renewed media coverage and another round of public reflection on the case. Journalists revisited the story, often focusing on how the community had changed, how the case had influenced policy, how the key figures had moved forward with their lives. Detective Williams, now fully retired and living in Oregon, gave her first extended interview about the case. Sitting in her comfortable home overlooking the Pacific, she spoke with careful consideration about the investigation that had ended her career. "People always want to know if I think we missed anything, if there was something we could have done differently," she said. "The truth is, I think about that every day. Could we have identified Ethan sooner? Maybe. Would it have mattered? I don't know. By the time we found him, he'd already killed. The real failures happened years earlier, when adults who saw warning signs chose to look away." She paused, gazing out at the ocean before continuing. "I've made peace with what we did. We got justice for Marcus. We prevented Ethan from killing again. But it doesn't feel like victory. Victory would have been Marcus still being alive, Ethan getting help before he escalated to murder. What we got was damage control, and that has to be enough because it's all we have." District Attorney Chen, who'd moved on to a judgeship, reflected on the prosecution with similar complexity. "We did our job. We presented the evidence. We secured a conviction. We ensured public safety. But there's no triumph in putting a child in prison for life, even when it's necessary. The whole case was just layers of tragedy. For Marcus, for his family, even in some ways for Ethan, who was born without the capacity to be fully human." This empathy for Ethan was controversial when excerpts from the interview circulated online. How could anyone feel sorry for a child who'd killed with such calculation and shown such cruelty? But Chen clarified, "I'm not excusing what he did. I'm acknowledging the reality that if psychopathy is a neurological condition someone is born with, then Ethan is in some sense a victim of biology. That doesn't mean he's not responsible for his choices. It doesn't mean he shouldn't be in prison. It just means the situation is more complex than simple good versus evil. This nuanced view was lost on many who preferred clear moral narratives. Online discussions of Chen's comments devolved into arguments about whether evil exists as a moral category or whether it's all ultimately reducible to biology and psychology. The debates were passionate but ultimately irresolvable. Questions that had troubled philosophers for millennia weren't going to be settled in comment sections. Ethan Crawford, now in her early 20s and living under her new identity, had built a life that was remarkable in its normalcy. She'd graduated college, was working in graphic design, had a partner who knew her history but didn't define her by it. She'd fought hard for this ordinary happiness, for the ability to exist as herself rather than as the sister of that killer. In a rare anonymous interview conducted through her therapist, she shared thoughts she'd never expressed publicly. People think my brother ruined my life, and for a long time, I thought so too. But I've learned that he only has the power I give him. Every day I choose to live with kindness, to form real connections, to be human in all the ways he never could. That's my victory over what he tried to make me become. Her resilience was inspiring, but it came at a cost that was invisible to outsiders. She still had nightmares about the animals she'd been forced to witness him torture. She still felt phantom guilt over Marcus Sullivan's death. The persistent thought that maybe if she'd been braver, if she'd spoken up sooner, he might have been saved. Therapy had taught her these thoughts were symptoms of trauma, not reflections of truth. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things. The psychological research community's interest in Ethan's case continued unabated. He'd become a teaching case in abnormal psychology courses worldwide, his story dissected in classrooms where future therapists and psychiatrists learned to recognize the signs of psychopathy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Ethan had wanted to be famous, to be recognized as special, and he'd achieved that goal, just not in the way he'd imagined. Several documentaries had been produced about the case, each taking different angles. Some focused on the investigation, praising the detective work that had led to his capture. Others examined the systemic failures, the missed warning signs, the adults who'd looked away. A few controversial productions attempted to humanize Ethan, to explore his psychology with what critics called inappropriate sympathy and defenders called necessary nuance. The most impactful documentary, however, was the one Grace Sullivan produced herself. Marcus's voice focused not on the killer, but on the victim, telling Marcus's story through interviews with people who'd known and loved him. It showed him as a complete person, his dreams, his humor, his kindness, his humanity. The film ended with a powerful message. When we obsess over monsters, we give them the attention they crave. When we remember victims, we honor the lives they lived. The documentary won awards and was used in victim advocacy training programs. It shifted the conversation, at least temporarily, away from the morbid fascination with Ethan and back toward the life that had been stolen. Grace had found a way to ensure Marcus's story would be told on his own terms, not just as a footnote to his killer's infamy. Inside the juvenile facility, Ethan continued his strange existence, simultaneously a child and a monster, legally required to receive education and treatment while being recognized as fundamentally dangerous. He participated in art therapy, producing technically impressive drawings that uniformly depicted themes of death and control. The art therapist's notes documented each piece as further evidence of persistent psychopathic ideation with no progression toward empathy or remorse. His reading choices were telling. He requested books about criminal psychology, neuroscience, famous serial killers, When staff limited his access to such materials, concerned he was using them as inspiration rather than education, he adapted, requesting books on persuasion, social engineering, manipulation techniques, materials that seemed innocent on the surface but were clearly being studied for their practical applications. One staff psychologist noted, "Subject treats his incarceration as a period of education and self-improvement. He's developing skills and knowledge he believes will be useful upon eventual release. His long-term thinking and patience are remarkable for someone his age, but deeply concerning given his demonstrated capacity for violence." The facility implemented strict protocols around Ethan's interactions with other juveniles. He wasn't allowed to develop close friendships or mentor relationships with younger residents. Staff had observed his attempts to gain influence over other troubled youth, to position himself as a source of advice and guidance. These weren't genuine connections. They were grooming behaviors, attempts to build a power base within the institution. One incident particularly alarmed administrators. A 15-year-old resident with developmental disabilities had become fixated on Ethan, viewing him as a friend. Staff noticed the boy beginning to parrot Ethan's speech patterns and viewpoints. When they intervened and separated the two, they found the boy had been writing letters at Ethan's direction. Letters that would have been sent to addresses Ethan provided, addresses that turned out to belong to people on his original target list. Ethan had been attempting to maintain surveillance on potential future victims through this unwitting proxy. The sophistication of the scheme, identifying a vulnerable person, manipulating him into compliance, using him to circumvent restrictions on Ethan's own communication, demonstrated an intelligence that would have been admirable in different circumstances. In his context, it was terrifying. The incident resulted in Ethan being placed in isolation for 6 months and permanent restrictions on his contact with other residents. He'd proven that, even within a controlled environment, he was actively working to maintain his predatory behaviors. The isolation was presented as punishment, but Ethan adapted to it with disturbing ease. Solitude didn't bother him. He'd always been most comfortable inside his own head. Dr. Torres's evaluations during this period noted a troubling development. The isolation seemed to intensify Ethan's fantasy life. Without external stimulation, he'd turned inward, elaborating complex scenarios in his mind. In therapy sessions, he'd occasionally let slip references to these fantasies. Detailed imagined scenarios of future violence, contingency plans for different circumstances, elaborate schemes he'd execute if given the opportunity. The isolation isn't rehabilitative for this subject, Dr. Torres wrote. It's providing him uninterrupted time to refine his violent ideation. However, integration with the general population poses risks to other residents. We face an impossible choice between two inadequate options. The facility's director, Martha Henderson, grappled with this dilemma. The juvenile justice system was designed for rehabilitation, built on the assumption that young offenders could change. But what do you do with someone who shows no capacity or desire for change? How do you manage a child who's fundamentally incompatible with the system designed to help him? Henderson implemented a compromise: limited, highly supervised contact with carefully selected staff members, educational programming delivered through individual instruction, structured activities that provided stimulation without opportunities for manipulation. It was resource-intensive and imperfect, but it was the best they could manage given legal and practical constraints. The annual reviews of Ethan's status became routinized. Each year, evaluators would assess his progress, document his continued lack of remorse, note his sophisticated manipulation tactics, and recommend continued secure detention. The reports were depressingly similar year after year, variations on the same theme: intelligent, articulate, completely devoid of empathy. Ongoing threat to public safety. By age 16, Ethan had physically matured, but remained psychologically unchanged. He stood nearly 6 feet tall, no longer the small boy who'd sat in that courtroom. But his eyes held the same flat affect, the same calculating emptiness. Staff who'd known him since his arrival noted that he'd become better at mimicking normal human interaction, but the improvement was in technique, not authenticity. He'd learned to modulate his voice to sound more emotional. He'd practiced facial expressions in his cell mirror until they looked more natural. He'd studied human behavior with the dedication of an actor preparing for a role, but it was all performance, all surface. Beneath the increasingly convincing mask, the same predator waited patiently for his opportunity. The question of what would happen when Ethan turned 18 and aged out of the juvenile system had been carefully considered. He'd be transferred to adult corrections, to a facility designed for individuals with his psychological profile. The hope was that in an adult prison, among hardened criminals rather than vulnerable juveniles, he'd find fewer opportunities to exercise his manipulative abilities. The reality would prove more complex. Marcus Sullivan's family had aged in the years since his death, the grief etching visible lines on faces that had once been untroubled. Grace's hair had gone gray. Robert moved more slowly, his vitality dimmed by loss. Marcus's brother had graduated college, gotten married, had a child, all milestones Marcus would never reach. The baby was named Marcus, a way of keeping his uncle's memory alive, ensuring his name would continue to be spoken with love. At family gatherings, there was always an empty space, an awareness of absence. They'd learned to function with their grief, to experience joy without betraying Marcus's memory, to move forward without leaving him behind. But holidays were hard. Birthdays were hard. Random Tuesday afternoons could be hard, when something would trigger a memory and the wound would feel fresh again. Grace often wondered what Marcus would have become. He'd wanted to be a social worker, to help troubled kids find better paths. The tragic irony wasn't lost on her. Her son had died at the hands of exactly the kind of troubled child he'd wanted to help. Would Marcus have been able to reach someone like Ethan? Could compassion and skill have made a difference? She'd never know, and the not knowing was its own form of torture. The Marcus Sullivan Foundation had helped dozens of families navigate the aftermath of violent crime. Grace had channeled her grief into action, becoming the kind of advocate she'd needed when her own world fell apart. She understood the shock, the disorientation, the rage, the guilt, the overwhelming bureaucratic complexity that followed sudden violent loss. She could guide people through it because she'd survived it herself. But privately, in moments alone, she still struggled with fundamental questions. Why had this happened to Marcus? What cosmic injustice allowed a good person to be destroyed by an evil one? Was there any meaning to be found in senseless tragedy? Or was meaning just something humans imposed on chaos to make it bearable? These questions had no answers, but asking them was part of how she processed her grief. The criminal justice system's treatment of juvenile offenders had evolved in the wake of cases like Ethan's. New assessment protocols were developed to distinguish between adolescent impulsivity and true psychopathy. Training programs taught professionals to recognize warning signs earlier. Specialized facilities were created for juveniles deemed too dangerous for traditional rehabilitation programs. But these changes came too late for Marcus Sullivan. They came too late for the families of other victims, whose lives had been taken by young killers who'd been misidentified as merely troubled rather than dangerous. Progress built on tragedy always carried that bitter knowledge. Each advancement represented someone who hadn't been saved, someone whose death had provided the impetus for change. The philosophical questions raised by Ethan's case continued to challenge legal scholars and ethicists. At what age does meaningful moral culpability begin? Can someone who lacks the neurological capacity for empathy be held morally responsible for actions that empathy would have prevented? If psychopathy is a disability, does that create an affirmative defense to crime, or does public safety override individual circumstances? Professor James Liu, who taught legal ethics at Stanford, used Ethan's case to illustrate these dilemmas to his students. The law, he'd tell them, is built on assumptions about human nature, that people can distinguish right from wrong, that they have the capacity to control their behavior, that punishment can serve as deterrent. But what happens when we encounter someone for whom these assumptions don't hold? How do we apply a system built for neurotypical humans to someone whose brain functions fundamentally differently? His students would engage in heated debates about responsibility, free will, the purpose of punishment. Some argued that lack of empathy should be treated like any other mental illness, with focus on treatment rather than punishment. Others countered that society's first obligation was protecting potential victims, regardless of why the threat existed. The discussions were intellectually stimulating, but emotionally exhausting, theoretical questions with real consequences for real people. In San Diego, the community had processed its trauma and moved forward, but the case remained part of the city's collective memory. Parents still referenced it when teaching their children about safety. Schools still used it as a case study in their threat assessment protocols. It had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil could emerge from unexpected places. The construction site where Marcus had been killed had been demolished and redeveloped into a community garden. Grace had advocated for the transformation, wanting something beautiful and life-affirming to replace the space where such horror had occurred. Local residents tended plots of vegetables and flowers. Children played in an adjacent playground. Life flourished where death had once reigned. A memorial stone bore Marcus's name and dates, along with an inscription Grace had chosen. He saw the good in everyone. Honor his memory by protecting one another. It was a message that captured both Marcus's spirit and the lesson of his death. Compassion and vigilance weren't opposites, but complementary values. As Ethan Crawford approached adulthood, the clock ticked toward his transfer to the adult correctional system. Staff at the juvenile facility who'd worked with him for years felt a complex mixture of relief at his departure and concern for what he might become with access to a broader criminal network. In juvenile detention, he'd been somewhat isolated. In adult prison, he'd encounter hardened criminals who might teach him new skills, might provide education in areas where he was currently limited. The facility psychologist preparing his transfer summary wrote, "Subject has spent his formative years in institutional settings, adapting to and manipulating those environments with remarkable skill. He views imprisonment as a temporary condition to be endured and overcome. His intelligence, patience, and complete lack of remorse make him a significant long-term threat. Future evaluators should be aware that he has spent years studying psychology and law, learning to present himself in ways that will appear rehabilitated. Trust no apparent progress at face value." This warning would be included in his permanent file, following him through every transfer, every evaluation, every parole consideration for the rest of his life. It was a scarlet letter of sorts, marking him as permanently dangerous regardless of what he might say or do to suggest otherwise. Detective Williams, in her Oregon retirement, sometimes walked along the beach and thought about the case that had defined the end of her career. She'd worked hundreds of investigations, had solved dozens of murders, had dedicated her life to justice. But Ethan Crawford remained her most troubling case, not because they'd failed to catch him, but because catching him felt like such an inadequate victory. They'd stopped him after one victim. That was important. That mattered. But Marcus Sullivan was still dead, Emma Crawford was still traumatized. A family was still shattered. Success in law enforcement was often measured by what you prevented, by crimes that didn't happen because you acted. But the crimes that did happen, the victims who weren't saved, those weighed on you differently. She wondered sometimes about the people on Ethan's list, the ones who'd never known how close they'd come to being victims. Did they ever think about it? Did they feel grateful for the randomness that had made Marcus the target instead of them? Or did they feel guilty, the survivor's guilt of being spared when someone else wasn't? She'd never asked them. Some questions were too heavy to impose on strangers. The true crime community's fascination with Ethan showed no signs of waning. New podcasts about the case appeared regularly, each promising unique insights or previously unrevealed information. Most recycled the same facts, adding nothing new but feeding the public's appetite for details about the case. The ethics of this industry, profiting from tragedy, potentially inspiring copycats, causing ongoing trauma to victims' families, were rarely addressed by the content creators themselves. Grace Sullivan had given up trying to control the narrative. She'd fought that battle and realized it was unwinnable. Instead, she focused her energy on the work of the foundation, on helping people who needed support, on advocacy that might prevent future tragedies. She couldn't stop strangers from being fascinated by her son's murder, but she could make sure his life had positive impact beyond his death. The letters Ethan received from admirers were disturbing documents that revealed a dark truth about human nature. Some people were attracted to evil, fascinated by it, drawn to those who'd committed acts they themselves never would. These letters praised Ethan's strength and intelligence, treated him as misunderstood rather than dangerous. Some included photographs, money, declarations of devotion from people who'd never met him, but felt some twisted connection. Facility staff screened these letters, keeping the most disturbing ones from him, while documenting their existence. The psychology of the letter writers was its own area of study. What drew people to romanticize killers, to imagine relationships with them, to invest emotional energy in someone whose defining characteristic was harming others. Some researchers suggested it was a form of thrill-seeking, a way to safely engage with danger. Others saw it as a manifestation of deep personal dysfunction. Ethan was aware these letters existed, even when he wasn't allowed to read them. He knew he had fans, admirers, people who were interested in him. This knowledge fed his narcissism, reinforced his belief in his own significance. In his mind, he'd achieved a form of immortality. His name would be remembered, studied, discussed long after he was gone. For someone whose greatest fear was being ordinary, this was validation. As his 18th birthday approached, marking his transfer to adult corrections, Ethan reflected on his time in juvenile detention in his journal. 6 years of observation, he wrote. 6 years of studying the humans who think they're studying me. I've learned their patterns, their weaknesses, their predictable responses. They think they know me. They have no idea who I am. They've seen only what I've chosen to show them. The arrogance in his words was striking, but not surprising. His sense of superiority had never wavered, had only grown more refined with age. He viewed everyone around him as players in his game, characters in his story. He was the protagonist of his own narrative, and everyone else existed only in relation to him. Dr. Torres, reading this journal entry during a routine review, felt a chill. After years of evaluating Ethan, he'd thought he understood the depths of his pathology. But this entry revealed something even more concerning. Ethan had been conducting his own psychological study of the staff, learning how to manipulate the very people tasked with evaluating his progress. The hunter mentality had never stopped. It had merely adapted to his circumstances. The transfer to adult corrections occurred on a gray Tuesday morning. Ethan was transported in a secure vehicle, shackled and monitored, from the only home he'd known for 6 years to a maximum security facility designed for California's most dangerous offenders. He'd be the youngest person there, but his youth would no longer afford him any special consideration. In the adult system, he'd be judged by his actions and his threat level, not his age. The receiving prison had been briefed extensively on his case. Guards were warned that despite his youth, he was highly manipulative and potentially dangerous. His cell was in a special housing unit reserved for inmates requiring protective custody or additional security. He wouldn't have the access to a general population that might allow him to find new victims or recruits. For the first time in years, Ethan was genuinely uncertain about his environment. Juvenile detention had become familiar. He'd mastered its rhythms and rules. Adult prison was new territory, and even his considerable confidence was shaken by the unknown variables. This was evident in his intake evaluation, where traces of genuine anxiety broke through his usual controlled presentation. But adaptation was what Ethan did best. Within weeks, he'd begun learning the culture of his new home, identifying power structures, recognizing opportunities. He was patient, careful, willing to spend months establishing credibility before making moves. The lessons of his capture, that impatience led to mistakes, had been well learned. Meanwhile, life continued for everyone whose orbit he'd disrupted. Emma Crawford was building her career and planning a wedding. Grace Sullivan was preparing for another year of advocacy, work, and remembrance. Detective Williams was volunteering with a cold case unit, unable to fully step away from the work that had defined her. Robert Sullivan was learning to be a grandfather, finding joy in his grandson while mourning the uncle the child would never know. The sun continued to rise over San Diego, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and orange. Surfers caught morning waves. Families walked to school. The city lived and breathed and moved forward, carrying its scars but refusing to be defined by them. But in a prison cell, a young man who should have been starting college or learning a trade instead sat calculating, planning, waiting. He had decades until his first parole hearing, decades to perfect his performance of rehabilitation, decades to study and scheme and prepare. He'd started his collection at 11. He'd been caught at 11. Now he was 18, smarter, more patient, more dangerous than he'd ever been. The story of Ethan Crawford and Marcus Sullivan wasn't over. It was merely paused, waiting for the next chapter that wouldn't be written for decades. And in that waiting lay a question that haunted everyone who knew the case. When a monster is caged, do you let yourself believe the cage will hold forever? Or do you spend every moment knowing that some prisons are temporary and some monsters are simply biding their time? The answer, uncomfortable and necessary, was vigilance. Eternal vigilance against the darkness that can wear a human face. Against the predators who walk among us, sometimes in bodies too small to inspire fear until it's too late. Marcus Sullivan had been kind to everyone. He'd seen good in people. He'd reached out to help a crying child, and it had killed him. His death was a lesson written in blood. Compassion without awareness is vulnerability. Kindness without wisdom is risk. But the alternative, a world where no one helps strangers, where every crying child is suspected, where trust is impossible, that was a world where the monsters had already won. The challenge was finding the balance, teaching both compassion and caution, acknowledging danger without surrendering to paranoia. As the years would pass, Ethan Crawford would grow older. His hair would gray. His body would age. But the essential emptiness at his core would remain, unchanged, unchangeable. He would learn new manipulation tactics. He would adapt to each environment. He would wait with the patience of a predator who knows that time is on his side. And every 5 years, Grace Sullivan would prepare for another parole hearing that wouldn't happen for decades. She'd organize her evidence, gather her statements, ready herself to face the person who destroyed her family. She'd do this until she couldn't anymore, until age or death stopped her. And then someone else, Marcus's brother, or his nephew, or some advocate from the foundation, would take up the cause. Because that's what justice required, not a single moment of victory, but sustained commitment to prevention. Not a sentence delivered once, but safety defended continuously. Not forgetting, but remembering Marcus, remembering the cost of looking away, remembering that some evils don't announce themselves with horns and tail, but arrive wearing an innocent face. The sun set over San Diego, and in the morning it would rise again. The cycle would continue, relentless and eternal. Life persisting in the face of death. Hope surviving alongside horror. The human capacity for both tremendous good and incomprehensible evil existing in the same world, sometimes in the same family, sometimes separated only by the accident of neurology and fate. And in the end, all we can do is remember, remain vigilant and refuse to let the monsters win, even when they wear the face of a child.